who may or may not be aware of what we are up to in terms of what the research has been telling us over the last 15, almost 20 years now. And then more recently, how we've developed this rapid assessment tool, which is proving very valuable and as a way to very quickly kind of assess the status of earthworm and impacts in forests, and it's really proving to be helpful. So just a real brief background, and if I don't know how you guys work this, if somebody wants to hop in with a question, you can, or if you want to save them all till the end, that's fine as well. So the potential impacts for earthworms to forests in general is very closely tied to the quantity and quality of the litter, and also the dry, wet soil types that those forests form on, and those are often quite closely linked. So drier conifer forests tend to be the least susceptible for non-native earthworm invasion, i.e. the earthworms really don't survive there well. They might survive there a little bit, but they don't produce large populations or very diverse populations. On the other end of the spectrum, we see these very moist sugar maple dominated basswood forests. I know in the central Great Lakes region you have the beech maple, and I think over on your end you have beech, hemlock, maple. What's the other dominant? Do you have tulip poplar all the way up there? Anyway, those are the types of more mesic maple dominated forests that are highly susceptible to non-native earthworm invasion and impacts because they produce large amounts of very palatable and nutritious litter. They tend to grow on more silty or loamy soils and moisture soils, so that can lead to very large and very diverse non-native earthworm populations, and ultimately that leads to large impacts. And I'll get into the details of that a little bit more. Just again, a very broad brush strokes here. What the research has shown us, you're looking at on the left-hand screen, understory plant communities in an unimpacted sugar maple dominated forest. You could expect to see total plant cover of 75 to 100% in the understory, within a very, very diverse assemblage of native plants and lots of tree seedlings, in particular the sugar maple seedlings. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a relatively heavily impacted area where you can get total cover dropping to under 25% and diversity dropping to literally just a couple of species. Carex pennsylvanicus and a suite of native carex tend to survive quite well. Erythema triphyllum, or jack-in-the-pulpit, seems to do quite well. And a lot of the other native species drop out. And associated with that change in plants, or perhaps what's really driving that change in plant composition, is the changes in the structure and the chemistry of the forest floor and the forest soils. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a relatively unimpacted forest floor layer. Does my cursor work here? Yeah. So this area here, this is about a 5-inch thick layer of, you'll hear it referred to as duff, or forest floor. And it's a very thick, spongy, slowly decomposing layer of organic material that's perched on top of the mineral soil. And it's very discreetly set on top of that mineral soil. There's not a lot of transport or mixing in that interface there. But what you see is this really diverse or very layered nature of this forest floor. So the intact leaves on the top, fragmented leaves here in this area, and then you get this very well decomposed organic material. And this is where the vast majority of the nutrient transformation or mineralization of nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that are happening. And so native plants tend to root almost exclusively in this forest floor. They'll send structural roots and water-seeking roots down into the mineral soil, but most of the feeder roots are up in this forest floor. And so that really sets the stage for big impacts when you have rapid invasion of earthworms, because literally the earthworms come in and eat this forest floor literally out from under the roots of the native plants. Now, in some conditions, some of the native plants are able to reestablish in this highly altered forest floor, and many are not. So this picture on the right shows a heavily impacted forest floor layer. You'll often see, especially in the spring, a layer of fresh whole litter from last year's fall, but in a heavily impacted site, if there's normal moisture, unlike last year, which I don't know if you guys had a bad drought, but we had a terrible drought. So even into the fall, we had large leaves still intact on the surface because it was so dry, the earthworms weren't very active. But in a normal year, by mid-July or early August, all those leaves are gone, and what we have replacing the forest floor and the upper layer of the mineral soil horizon is a very thick, fairly compacted, what you would consider a horizon if you're a soil scientist, this dark, good, black, rich topsoil, which is not present in the uninvaded area. The short version of the story is that most native plants are not well adapted to this type of soil. They can grow in it. Many of us grow trilliums and bellworts and all the native plants that really tend to disappear following earthworm invasion in gardens, and they do well in this dark, rich soil, which is full of earthworms. But an agricultural or garden system is really quite different, and what's happening is that the impacts are a result of the initial invasion and then lack of recovery, as far as we can tell. And there's lots of things that can cause that lack of recovery, which I'm going to try to get to. Some other visual symptoms of heavy invasion, on the left-hand side, we call it forest gingivitis. On the left-hand side, you'll see a relatively unimpacted area where you have forest floor and moss well up on the buttresses and the root crown of the trees and plants growing all around it. And then on the right, a very heavily impacted site where not only the forest floor has been eaten, so that 5 to 6 inches of forest floor is missing, but there's actual compaction of the mineral soil horizon. So you get this sinking and exposure of the root crowns. On mature trees, that doesn't appear to cause tree death. We suspect that it's leading to some large limb loss, or although we haven't quantified that yet. But for sure, we have seen that it leads to sapling and seedling death because they can't survive heavy exposure of those leaves. And now some of you might be saying, what about compaction? I thought earthworms were supposed to be decompactors. You go out on the street and you ask people if earthworms are good for the soil, and they'll say, yeah, and you say, why? And they'll say something to the effect of, well, they mix and aerate the soil, or they break up and aerate the soil. And that's true. All the research that demonstrates that that's true, or the vast majority of it, comes from agricultural research. And if you look at the densities of the soil in agricultural systems on average, and I'm really speaking broad averages, so don't anybody get too upset here, that agricultural systems tend to have bulk densities, grams of dry soil per cubic centimeter of in excess of 1 gram per cubic centimeter, where the bulk density in these native earthworm-free forests tends to be about 0.5 grams. And the bulk density of earthworm cast material is approximately 0.8 grams. So it's not that earthworms are necessarily compactors or decompactors. It just depends on where you start on that continuum. If you start at point 1 in an agricultural system, you add worms, they're going to be a decompactor. If you start at point 6 in a native forest and you add worms, they're going to be a net compactor. So it's all relative to the ecosystem that those animals are found in. Oh, one of my pictures is missing here. Oh, there it is. So some other interactions that we have been exploring, and more evidence is coming out in publications, which I can't really explain all in detail here. But deer grazing for sure has big implications. The basic theory goes that earthworms invade these hardwood forests. They eat the forest floor and they knock back the standing crop of native plant populations. But they don't completely eliminate them. But the deer population is still grazing on that remaining forest floor. And so now the same deer population is eating a larger proportion of the remaining plant population. And so then in that situation, they can actually drive kind of the 1-2 punch and drive those native populations to extinction. We've been looking at this, and others have been looking at it with deer exclosures, and we do see some recovery of some native species when deer are excluded. And so in a strange and twisted way, deer control, really heavy deer, really aggressive deer control might be a way to mitigate some of the impacts of earthworm invasion, since you can't remove the earthworms once they're there. Once a site has been invaded for long periods of time and there are large expanses of raw, open, bare soil, they're highly susceptible to invasion by other invasive plants. And in our region, the two most deviant of those are the European buckthorn and the garlic mustard. And there are others, but those are the two that really drive us the most nuts. I suspect that you have others on your end of the lakes as well. And there's more and more data that's starting to really show that the earthworm invasion is a facilitating, and we don't understand the mechanisms of how it happens. One might suppose that, you know, these are European species, and so therefore European earthworms create soil conditions that are more conducive. It might just be the loss of the forest floor, and then these species, which can colonize the exposed mineral soil more effectively. So there's still a lot of unknowns in terms of the mechanisms, but the relationship is very strong. We also see, and there's been a fair amount of data, and it's still more and more is being learned all the time about how earthworm invasions are causing a really dramatic shift in soil, forest floor, and invertebrates from a very, very large, very, very diverse populations to very small and species poor systems. And it's not all, they don't all become slugs, but the dusky slug, which is a European slug, is one species that we have found in a lot of our heavily invaded earthworm sites that, again, is a kind of a positive or negative, however you describe it, feedback loop. Earthworms invade, they knock back the forest floor, they knock back these other invertebrates, they create good habitat for this dusky slug, which happens to be an herbivore. So it actually has become a predator on new plants that are growing. So any plants that are, any seeds that are in the seed bank that germinate, if the deer don't get them, the slugs usually do. Is anybody depressed yet? But it's not all hope. It's not all terrible. So, although I'm going to talk a little bit more about terribleness right here. So, ground nesting birds. A paper just came out. If you haven't seen it, Loss and Blair, 2001, Conservation Biology. We've thought that this was that earthworms could be affecting the nest success of ground nesting birds in these forests for a long time. We finally have some really good data that shows that, in fact, that's what's happening. And in particularly ovenbird, but Scott Loss also looked at hermit thrushes and black and white warblers, which are ground gleaners, although they don't nest right on the ground. And all three of those species had negative relationships. Their nesting success declines substantially in relation to the level of earthworm invasion of the site. And this is potentially due to several different mechanisms. One is the loss of cover, which they need for their nest, so they may be experiencing increased predation of their nest sites. Another is the loss of the forest floor and the loss of the invertebrates, which are an important food source for nestlings. And so oftentimes they'll lay a nest, but they're not successful at fledging chicks. And sometimes they'll even try to re-nest, but again, not successfully. And one thing we found out before we got to this end point, we tried looking at calling rates because we have the Minnesota breeding bird, we have decades worth of data, and we have a lot of good information on where earthworm invasion is and isn't and at what levels, and we found no correlation between calling and earthworm invasion status. And what this final study really told us is that the males are there and they're calling, but it doesn't mean they're breeding or they're breeding successfully. And so unfortunately, calling surveys are not sufficient to assess earthworm impacts on these birds. You really have to do the nest studies, which we all know are hard and costly, but it's what we need to do to really demonstrate that relationship. Amphibians and reptiles, you're probably all familiar with John Merritt's work on salamanders. Very interesting in that the females tended to become more fecund, actually produce more offspring in earthworm invaded sites because earthworms are good, really nutritious stuff for the female salamanders. But because of the loss of the small invertebrate community, the young didn't survive well because they can't eat the worms. They relied on the small invertebrates. So the population as a whole declined. And that really brings to bear the concept that you have to think about what's the most vulnerable part of the life cycle of any given organism that might be affected by earthworms, and in what way might they be affected. So just studying the adult females, you would think, well, earthworms are having a positive effect on salamanders. But when you look at another part of the life cycle, you realize that the net effect is quite negative. We did a pilot study also looking at small mammals, and we'd love to collaborate with somebody who is interested in doing more work on this. Basically what we saw in this one pilot study was a shift, and this was a study that was done in one site and one stand, so not in any way comprehensive. A lot more work needs to be done. But we have a fairly large stand, about half of which is invaded and the other half is uninvaded, and ran trap lines across this leading edge of earthworm invasion. And what we found is in the area of that stand that is uninvaded by earthworms, the small mammal populations was dominated by small shrews and redback voles. And on the other end of the stand that had very little forest floor, the small mammal population was dominated by large-bodied voles, microtus, and deer mice. So big shifts in small mammal populations. The CDC is interested in this because deer mice have been targeted as one of the vector species for Lyme's disease, so there may be a connection there as well. And then finally, native plants, especially those that are small-seeded and have obligate mycorrhizal fungal associates, tend to be exceptionally vulnerable to earthworm invasion, and more research is coming out. In fact, there's a paper that I just reviewed that hopefully will be out soon that looked at Goodyear and how earthworms are affecting the viability of those orchids, and I think it has implications for other native orchids throughout the region because orchids are so mycorrhizal specific, and earthworms do change the mycorrhizal assemblages in these forests. Okay, and last but not least, earthworms are for sure changing the nutrient and hydrologic processes in these systems, not only in the upland terrestrial systems, but also in the aquatic systems that they're linked to. So this little graphic shows, you know, the nice little tents and stuff, and you got little circles of N and P, so not as much sediment and nutrients, and then you've got the chicken in the house, and you might as well put the worms, no worms on this side and worms on this side because the effects are pretty much the same, and there's more and more work. Costello and Lamberti just in the last couple of years published a few papers looking at this hydrogen or the nitrogen pump that goes on in these riparian edges of streams and waterways. And we're beginning efforts to try to look at how earthworm invaded uplands affect the hydrology and the nutrient loading and sedimentation of vernal pools, which, as you all know, are really critical habitat for a large number of terrestrial and aquatic organisms in these hardwood forests. So we're hoping to get some more look at that. Okay, so this whole cascade of effects resulting from European earthworm invasion, we've begun to call forest decline syndrome. That's what we call it. So just to try to go back, what the research tells us so far is that the larger the biomass of earthworms, so the more biomass of earthworms present increases the impacts, but also the number of species or ecological groups that are present greatly impacts the potential for larger ecological impacts. And there are, and for those of you who aren't versed in worms, a worm is not a worm is not a worm. Different worms have different burrowing and feeding behaviors, and they can be broadly categorized into epigeic, or litter-dwelling species, strictly litter-dwelling species, upper litter and upper mineral soil dwelling species, which feed primarily on surface litter and form no permanent burrow systems. And then these light-colored species are referred to as endogeic, endo meaning end, geic meaning soil. They burrow and feed in the mineral soil horizon down to about ½ meter. They feed primarily on soil organic matter that they ingest with mineral soil and then create this casting. And it's the appearance of these endogeic species and this little guy here, Lumbricus rubellus, that really start enforce the rapid transition of that forest floor layer into that A horizon, that compacted A horizon, which is primarily made up of cast material. And then the most heavily impacted sites are those that contain a real wide diversity of species, and particularly this, the big guy, the nightcrawler, which most of you are probably familiar with. So each of these have different, slightly different feeding and burrowing habits, and when you put all that together in one place and then have very large populations, you can really have extremely large impacts. So the development of this IRAT was really in response to land managers and others in our region who said, we really want to start assessing earthworm levels of impact, but the quantitative sampling method is just very effort intensive and it's geographically limited. You can only get so many so many undergrads to haul so many hundreds of gallons of water a mile or so into the woods before they just quit. Luckily, we didn't have any quit during the middle of the field season, but it's very difficult, and it's not something that can easily be integrated into current surveys that are being done by land managers. And so what we wanted to do was to try to find a more qualitative method that was still ecologically fairly accurate, but much easier to use, so that land managers could at least get a first assessment of the earthworm invasion status of their forests. We ultimately developed a system using visual indicators, and we focused on the two most dominant forest types in our hardwood forest types in our region, aspen, birch, and maple dominated forests. We ended up with we surveyed using the visual indicators over 2,000 points, and then from those 2,000 points, we selected 434, which we actually went back and did quantitative sampling so that we could really validate that these visual indicators, how well they were correlated to the quantitative measures that we were looking at. And we found, to our pleasure, that it worked really pretty well. And since that time, we've been field testing this tool with a whole range of partners in our region, and we're having really good results. So, So the IRAT classification systems were the categories, 1 being uninvaded, 5 being heavily invaded, were very highly correlated with the earthworm species assemblages, the total earthworm biomass, as well as vegetative changes reflecting ecological impacts. And that the results of our field testing with land managers verified the ecological pieces, but also really we wanted to focus on, is this tool going to help you effectively and efficiently survey large areas of your land so that you can use them effectively? And what we found, the land managers do like it. It's easy to integrate into annual survey activities, and you may consider this good or bad. What people really wanted from us was something they could download off the internet and take out into the field and use. And we tested that explicitly. We had control groups that just got the pamphlet and all the instructions with illustrations and examples and sent them out into the field. And then we had another group that we gave them all that information and a 2-hour field training. And the people with the 2-hour field training had much higher correlation with the results that were gotten by our quantitative surveys. So the take-home message is that the tool itself is good, but it's really good if you pair it with a half-day field training to really standardize results. And so we really advocate that, because what we would like to have this tool used for is to develop broad geographic maps of levels of earthworm impact across the region. And so that, for that reason, the more standardized those results can be, the better. So what the IRAT told us was basically what the quantitative earthworm information told us. So the IRAT stage 1, you have just this Dendrobana octaedra, the litter-dwelling species. IRAT stage 3, you tend to have that and Lumbricus rubellus. And then in IRAT stage 4, we start to see the endogeeic species arriving, and then in IRAT 5, we get this wide assemblage. So very strongly correlated with species assemblages and biomass. You're not supposed to be able to read this whole thing here, but these are some of the visual assessment characteristics that go into the classification system. I'm going to move on there. Oh, I didn't know I had that animated. Okay, so how am I doing on time? Can somebody give me feedback on that? No? Okay, then I'm just going to keep talking.
Yeah, you're doing well. You got about 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh, well, you think I'm doing well. I know how many more slides I have. Okay, so stage 1, some of the visual indicators. Stage 1 is earthworm-free, fully intact earthworm forest floor. So you've got the OL layer, the OE layer, which is the fragmented, the OE layer, or OA layer, which is the decomposed layer. That transitions quite quickly to an E horizon, no A horizon present. In stage 2, or minimally impacted, you'll get the compaction of those 3 O horizons, but they're all still present. And you may get the beginnings of an A horizon, but not much. And then stage 3, you really start to see the loss of the forest floor. You'll still see the fresh litter, and you may still see some of the fragmented litter, but most of that really decomposed litter that, again, I recall was the primary rooting zone for a lot of the native plants, that's largely been eliminated. And so this stage is where you really start to see vegetational changes. And that's very strongly linked to this guy here, Lumbricus rubellus. The research has shown us and other researchers across the country that Lumbricus rubellus appearance really does facilitate much more rapid change in the forest flora and in the plant communities. Also, you see the appearance of surface castings and more castings in the soil horizon. Surface castings are these little rounded globular soil aggregates, and they look very different than non-earthworm worked soil aggregates, which have much more of a crumb-like structure. And this is why a field training is really helpful, because you get to see all this stuff. It's hard. The best picture in the world is nothing compared to seeing it, touching it. You really get it in that field training. So in a stage 4, basically a stage 4 is similar to a stage 3 in that, but you have the addition of Lumbricus Lumbricus terrestris, the night crawler, and the appearance of middens or terrestris middens. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Lumbricus terrestris, or the night crawler, is a large-bodied species that forms vertical unbranching burrows, and then it casts around the opening of its burrow, and then it feeds on fresh litter. So as it's dragging litter into the mouth of its burrow, that mouth of that burrow tends to get jam-packed full of leaf petioles and leaf veins, and it forms this little hump. And once you get the search image for it, I mean, you could be in a forest you've been in for 10 years and never have noticed it, and all of a sudden when you get the search image for these middens, they're everywhere in a heavily impacted site. Now, a stage 4 is distinguished from a stage 5 in that it has low abundance, so less than 3 middens per square meter. And we get to a stage 5, or a heavily impacted earthworm system, when you have 3 to 20 or more nightcrawler middens per square meter. So by the time you reach this stage, it's pretty obvious you have this very thick A horizon, maybe fragmentary fresh litter, and some fragmentary E horizon. But this fragmentation that you see in this litter layer is largely the result of earthworm feeding behavior as opposed to natural decomposition of the leaves. So it's fundamentally a quite different system. So the potential use for land managers, we did find that it was a very effective tool that they could add to their normal monitoring effects. How long did it take them to complete an IRAT once they were trained in it? 81% of land managers reported being able to complete it in 2 to 6 minutes. So you decide for yourselves whether that's doable. Most of them seem to think that it was a doable thing, and it has been incorporated in a lot of their annual surveys. And the most exciting potential for this is that it could potentially lead to rapid expansion of the geographic data on the extent and level of earthworm invasion across large regions. And for northern Minnesota, we have really expanded the range of what we know in terms of earthworm invasion. And this is really driving the research now that we're undertaking, because we have a really good understanding of what the distribution is of earthworm invasion status. And some people may say, well, it's all lost, but really it's not. So the green here is, either unimpacted or only that one dendrobana. And then this light beige is 1 to 2 or very low impacts, and then 3 and 4 are the higher impacted sites. So you can see, even if you don't look at the green, you look at all the other areas, well, you say those are all already invaded by earthworms, but almost 50% or a large proportion of the invaded areas still only have 1 or 2 species. And the impacts, though they are present, are much less than the impacts in a heavily invaded site. And so these areas, right here, this whole region, is an area that we're targeting for prevention, education, and prevention methods to prevent the introduction of new species. If we can limit the advance or the introduction of additional species, we could buy ourselves literally hundreds of years to potentially find a solution. Maybe global warming will do it for us. And so having this information can be very, very valuable in directing research efforts and identifying priority areas for protection. Land managers agree that the IRAT's wonderful and blah, blah, blah. So is it already too late? No, I kind of went over that. 20% of the landscape is still fully earthworm free, and of the invaded areas, about 50% are minimally impacted. And the good thing, if you can say that, is that earthworms, unlike gypsy moth and a lot of the other insect pests, don't spread very well on their own. Natural spread is very, very slow, 7 to 10 meters a year. Do the math.
Yeah,
it takes.
Can see when they're going.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry? Oh, I heard a comment there, but anyway. So human activities is the primary vector. So education, land use policies that can prevent the introduction of additional species or new species can really have a big positive impact on limiting the spread of earthworms. New emerging species are definitely on the forefront and need to be watched for, in particular species that are being marketed on the internet and via vermicomposting or gardening and composting in general. We, in the last 4 years, have documented 5 new species, 2 in the Amynthus or Asian, they're Alabama jumper. They call them Alabama jumpers even though they're not from Alabama. The African nightcrawler, the Indian blue worm, and these things called super reds, Icenia hortensis and Icenia veneta. These species are different than the suite of European species that we just talked about in that they can have very large single species impacts. We've got a handful of epicenters of invasion of Amynthus that we've been monitoring in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we have what we call this nothing grows here syndrome. They're very prevalent as compost worms, and they're readily available online, and we're just finishing a manuscript we hope to be submitting for publication soon that documents that the vast majority of those people selling earthworms online don't know what they have. So you may order red wigglers, Encina fetida, but you might get Encina fetida, Encina hortensis, Amynthus, a mixture of them. Most vendors don't know what they have, and if they're selling them as one thing, they may or may not be that, or they may be contaminated by something else. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And so what about the rest of the Great Lakes region? We've been working a lot with Ohio and the Cleveland and Columbus area, and they've been beginning to implement the IRAT there and starting to collect some really, really interesting data. There's more of an Amynthus invasion in Ohio than we have currently in Minnesota and Wisconsin, which frankly is just fine with me. So it's a good place for us to try to work with people to try to figure out how to develop an IRAT that incorporates impacts based on these other European, Asian, and non-European species. My guess is that in certain areas of New York, you have big areas of Amynthus and other non-European species and other areas where they're European dominated. And so, I don't know to what degree you have that information. And so what we would love to do next is locate funding to host an IRAT training in your area and begin collaborations with folks in your area to develop an IRAT with a focus on adding Amynthus and other emerging species, and then continuing working with our partners in any way we can to develop effective educational outreach programs, quantifying and describing the vectors. And we're just beginning now in Minnesota to have interagency discussions, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, the DNR, the Nature Conservancy, and the legislature on actions that we might be able to take in terms of regulatory or guidelines or training. Earthworms, if you haven't dug into the regulatory environment around earthworms in your area, and I assume it's similar to ours, it's very weird because earthworms are a terrestrial organism, but they're largely spread through aquatic vectors. i.e. in Minnesota, historically fishing bait was the primary vector. Now composting and vermicomposting is becoming a more important vector. They also get spread via forest logging equipment and ATVs. We have another manuscript that's in prep that will be coming out very soon that documents that in fact those can be significant vectors. And so equipment hygiene and land use policies regarding ATVs could be important in protecting those sites that are minimally impacted. But it's a very weird thing because MDA, Minnesota Department of Ag, is tasked with controlling or preventing the infestation of terrestrial species. Aquatic species is a DNR, but they end up having to cross those lines oftentimes. And so we're working on trying to figure out a comprehensive strategy rather than having each agency do it independently. And at least we're talking to each other, which is good. No fist fights yet. So what can we do now? There's no method of removing earthworms. Education and monitoring are really our best prevention of spread. We have found, we're just finishing another study where we looked at the effectiveness of using bait labels. While it's small, the effect of bait labels is significant in terms of altering angular behavior and getting them to throw unused bait into the trash rather than dumping it on the land or in the water. And if anybody wants some of these labels, I've got like 10,000 rolls of them in my office, which I would be happy to share with you. We have the Container Crawlers poster, which is on our website. It's a PDF. You can download it and use it to your heart's content. We've also just put up on our website best management practices for vermicomposting, just identifying the threats and things that people who are using worms for vermicompost should be aware of. And you know, all of this stuff is still very seminal, but we're trying to put things out there to help the education component, and we'd be happy to work with any of you on any of that stuff. The second edition of my book, Earthworms of the Great Lakes, is due to be back from the printer any day now, according to the publisher. It's got a lot of new illustrations. We added new species, and there's an expanded research section that adds some of the stuff that we didn't know when the first edition came out, and the vermicomposting piece. So I think that the new book is a big improvement, and I hope everyone will buy it because it helps us do our outreach and our program. So. Ryan Huffmeyer is my hero. He's my lab coordinator, and he does a fabulous job of helping keep on top of the literally hundreds of emails we get every day and calls. But we really want to partner with folks, especially folks like you who are out there on the front lines dealing with invasive species and protection efforts. So please contact us, and we will do whatever we can to help.